Welcome or welcome back to Solidarity on the Bench, a podcast for 20-somethings by a 20-something. I'm your host, Katie Yu, and on this podcast, we talk about everything and anything with a focus on mental health and personal well-being. New episodes every Tuesday at 11 a.m. PST. All right, I am joined today with Dr. Noam Raiter, which I was telling her at the beginning of this recording is a really big moment for me because she was like one of the first kind of wellness lifestyle influencers that I followed in this space. And so to have Noam be on the podcast is very incredible for me, but she is the coolest person ever. She's a resident doctor. She has her podcast, as I said before, like influencer, and she basically does it all. And I'm really excited to get to chat with you today.
I'm so excited to be here. I'm like blushing. But again, I was saying earlier before we started recording that it's always like really crazy to know that someone like actually like listens to your podcast or just like even follows you and like cares. So that's so cool. And I mean, I've been a fan of yours. I've been following your account for a while and love all your mental health content. And I've been really inspired by a lot of it. And yeah, I'm so excited to chat today. I think it's gonna be such a great conversation.
To the people who don't know you, do you want to give like a brief overview of who you are and what you do in the online space?
Absolutely. Yeah. So my name is Noam. I'm 25. I live in Toronto. I'm in my second year of family medicine residency. So for anyone who's not really in the medical field, it's kind of like when you're watching Grey's Anatomy, sort of like I'm a doctor, but I'm still in training. And yeah, I'm also a content creator on social media, mainly Instagram and TikTok. My handle is my name, but really I've just been posting since I was in medical school about my journey in medicine. But I like there's a big community of like medicine influencers online, and not that there's anything wrong with that at all, but I think I always have to like kind of preface with saying that my goal was never to share like here are the top tips for how to ace your rotation or how to study for your exam. It was really just to humanize the experience, because I know when I was in pre-med before I was in medical school, I didn't really see anyone online talking about what it was actually like to be in medicine, but more importantly, women online talking about what it was like to be in medicine, and women who also liked taking photos or doing their hair and makeup, or also just talking about their mental health and being vulnerable and not just pretending like everything was perfect all the time. So yeah, I mean, it's about my journey in medicine, but really it's just kind of like about my day-to-day life and trying to be as vulnerable as possible. But yeah, and I have a podcast, which is You Are Not Too Busy podcast. But yeah, I can jump into more detail on anything, but that's, I guess, me in a nutshell.
Yeah, I have questions about your podcast coming up, but before we kind of dive into that, I'm asking all of my guests in 2024 this one question, and I'm aiming to do this because I want to destigmatize like, mental health and asking for help. And so, when was the last time you asked for help?
Oh, that's such a good question, because I am so bad at asking for help. This isn't my answer, but literally last night at dinner, I was at dinner with my boyfriend and I was like talking about how like, wow, I really had the realization in 2023 that like I don't ask for help to a fault. And like that's something I'm definitely working on. But when's the last time I asked for help? It was probably like my dad with something around the apartment, because I feel like I was saying, I think I often try to just like I can just solve everything and like I can just learn how to do everything and figure it out on my own. And I was like, no, like I actually like don't know how to fix my laundry machine. And it sounds so small, but I think for anyone who relates to that of like not ever wanting to feel like they're burdening other people or always being the person who can just like have it figured out and let people worry about other things, even asking for small things can be hard. But yeah, I love that question. That's such a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I really hear that with like not knowing how to do things around the house. I have just kind of moved into my first apartment, and I'm so glad my flatmate loves to like be a handy woman and she has like her toolbox and all that stuff because I would have no idea where to start. And I do ask her all the time, like, can you fix this? Like, can you check this? Can you look at this? So I hear that. It's like we are not taught how to do that, and asking for help in that sense, it's like it feels like something you should already know, but you don't. And then there's that embarrassment that comes with that too. So it's important definitely to ask for help around the
Yeah.
house. So your podcast, You Are Not Too Busy Pod, we talked about it a little bit, but I said it was one of the first podcasts I have ever listened to. Like it's just so soothing, it's so down to earth, and you've been an inspiration to me for a while, especially with like how much you do. I mean, being a full-time content creator and also being like a resident doctor, doing all of that, it has been really cool and really inspiring. So in the sense of like you can do it all, what does balance and productivity mean to you?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think also with like the title of You Are Not Too Busy. I remember when I was like picking a title for my podcast, and I kind of always knew I wanted it to be that. Um But I also never wanted it to be misconstrued in terms of this like toxic productivity mindset of like, oh, you can just do everything and never take a break. And you like don't need to slow down or whatever it might be. And I didn't want to be misconstrued as that because to me it kind of means the opposite. And like in introing my podcast and when I ever talk about it, like the way I see it is like you're not too busy to take time for yourself. You're not too busy
Mm-hmm.
to focus on your mental health. You're not too busy to squeeze in a workout, to have a nutritious meal, to spend time with your friends. So I guess it's almost like productivity, but spinning productivity to see all those things that fill up our cup as actually productive as well, which is what I think I had to reframe for myself in that, like I said, taking care of your body, taking care of your mental health, just doing things that you enjoy, spending time doing your hobbies, those things are also productive. So it, in a sense, kind of falls into the toxic productivity of like, you can do it all, but you can do it all and not just the things that are going to translate into better grades or more money or you to appear a certain way or whatever it might be. So I think like along that same pipeline is also how I like when people ask me like, oh, how do you find the time to do XYZ when it comes to like taking care of yourself or like how do you find time to work out in residency? And I think it's just in my head reframing that as something productive, as like this is something that isn't a second choice. This is equal or like as important as doing well in residency is also taking care of myself. So it's not that one overlaps the other. Maybe at certain times, like there's exams and whatever, and sometimes you have to let things
Mm-hmm.
fall to the back burner, or sometimes work isn't as busy. Like right now, I have some time off for the holidays, so I'm spending more time journaling, working out, etc. But at baseline, I kind of see all these things as equal, and I think that that really helps find balance. Is when you really believe yourself that your well-being is worth taking care of, if that makes
Mm-hmm.
sense.
And I completely get that from your content as well. I think what has really inspired me since you've been posting is this idea that like your work is not your life. And I think that, in this day and age, we're always like, oh, what's your dream career? And we have focuses on
Mm-hmm.
academics and dream colleges and dream jobs. But you're like, you can have a life outside of something as time consuming and as like mentally consuming as being a doctor. And so that's been really cool for me to kind of see and also remind myself of being like, yeah, you're right. Like I am a busy person, but I'm not too busy to take care of myself and to put my mental health first. And I like what you're saying is like the equal priority stuff. I think that whenever I'm asked that question as well, it's like, how do you do it all? It's like, well, that's just my priority. Like my priority
Mm-hmm.
is to do XYZ, is to take care of myself. And so that's how I do it. It's like something has to give, and it's not going to be going to the gym or doing my self-care or getting myself a little treat. Like something else is going to give, but it's not going to be that.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I think what you said is so important that like in our society, we are so career forward and so career centric. I mean, even when you asked me like introduce yourself, I spoke about like my two different careers in medicine and online. And I think it's something I catch myself doing. And I'm definitely still working on separating for myself. I think it's also like would be so dishonest for me to say like I have it all figured out and like I don't put any emphasis on my standing in my career and my productivity like I obviously do. And I think as a lot of people who are like more type A or just more like academia focused, it's really hard to separate yourself from that, especially when you're in an environment that promotes that and that like you've really been ingrained since you were probably like in your first year of undergrad and your freshman year, told that like your grades are your value. Like it's really hard to separate yourself from that. But I think just calling it out and when you do it and when other people do it politely, I mean, I think
Mm-hmm.
that's the first step, even if you don't actually have the solution, but just being like, oh, like I recognize that I still need to work through that. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you feel the same way, but like going into being kind of an adult, like I'm a master's student, so technically I'm still a student, but there are less kind of markers of success in my adult life that like I have lost because in college, you're always
Mm-hmm.
getting marked on something. You're always being told that you're doing a good job, and you're always being told that you can do whatever you want, whatever you set your mind to. And then you get to adulthood and you're like, oh, I don't know what success looks like for me. I don't know what,
Totally.
doing good as an adult looks like for me. And so there is that like kind of drop in dopamine almost, that we have
Mhm.
to relearn how to like give ourselves other success markers. And I think that comes with taking care of ourselves. Like that is a success marker that we can set goals for ourselves, like in the gym, in how much we eat, in the new recipes we try. And like that's another kind of definition of success that we should bring into as an adult.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's you put it really, really beautifully when you said it that way. I think I kind of first had that realization when I went from undergrad into medical school. Every medical school is different, but in my specific medical school, there was in a way a smaller emphasis on grades because we weren't given like a numeric number of like you got a 90%, whatever. You just kind of got like you either didn't pass, you passed, or you did really well. And like it wasn't as specific. And just kind of the way they structured like teaching in my school wasn't the same as maybe some other medical schools where you were like ranked with your classmates. And I definitely felt that, like you're saying, like that drop of dopamine of like, I didn't really know I didn't know based on my grades how well I was doing. I knew how well I was doing based off like verbal or written feedback from my preceptors off of just like how confident I felt in a clinical environment. And that was a huge shift for me. And I know for a lot of my classmates as well. And I don't know if my med school meant to do this, but it's something I really enjoyed about the school I went to because I think it really helped me in real life separate myself because that's medical school. And then in residency, we're all, no matter what medical school you go to, you're all in the same residency programs. Essentially, there's different schools, but not the point. But
Mhm.
there really is not as much like concrete feedback. Like I haven't had an exam since I started residency and I only have one, my board's at the end. So I don't really get that constant reassurance other than, yeah, sometimes preceptors will give you feedback, but they barely do that now. So I've really had to learn to find my own validation from myself and not just from external validation, essentially. But that's the real world too, right? So like once I'm done
Mhm.
residency, I'm going to have none of that. No one's really going to be telling me that. Maybe my patients saying, thank you so much. Like you did a great job. Or of course, I mean, on social media, that's a whole other ballpark and we get tons of external validation there, which maybe isn't super healthy at times. But yeah, I mean, I think it's so important. It's something that I think we all learn at some point. I think the longer you stay in academia, the more it delays that learning, if that makes sense. Like it kind of holds you back
Mhm.
in a way that I think people who either straight out of high school or straight out of undergrad went into the workforce maybe catch up to there a bit sooner.
Mhm. And while you were talking, I was one of the questions I wrote down that I kind of want to shift to is this idea of like un being unproductive. And I got this from your reel about pottery, which I
Mhm.
loved. And like this idea of like make art, waste time, like have hobbies that you don't feel the need to monetize, that you don't feel the need to like show off, that you do just for yourself. So could you speak more on kind of like pottery and maybe your goals for 2024 surrounding this like unproductivity?
Totally, yeah. I love that, "Make art, waste time." I love that saying, but yeah, I think I started having this realization that I had no hobbies when I was applying to residencies. So after medical school, you basically go through like a matching process and you apply for a job as a resident, and you have to have like a super extensive CV. And part of the CV, and I think sometimes it's almost like performative, like I don't know if programs actually care, but they tell you like, "Oh, put some hobbies, put some like fun facts about yourself on your CV to like look more like a human," which is like kind of a weird concept. But anyways, and I had some hobbies. I spent a lot of time when I was in medical school on social media. And then I was, in a way, even those hobbies. So let's say my hobby was working out, which I really enjoyed. I love Pilates and yoga and things like that. But I started posting about them. So yes, it was my hobby, but I kind of felt like I was, in a sense, monetizing it or at least making it productive by sharing it.
Mhm.
Or you could say like my hobbies was like I love to cook and bake, but those would be like healthier meals, and then I would also like eat them. So I'm like that's not really like there was nothing I was doing that was like truly unproductive and was not a means to an end in some way. Because if I
Mhm.
was taking care of myself, like I considered almost like wellness my hobby because it took up so much of my time. But obviously, wellness is also productive because the end goal is to be a better version of yourself. And I almost became like, I don't want to say obsessed, but really fixated on like being the best version of myself, which I think was, as someone who was always very goal focused, I kind of made that my goal. And same thing with like the books I
Mhm.
was reading. I was reading like self improvement books about productivity and habits and wellness and diet and all these things. And I was enjoying them and I still do enjoy that, but it was still ultimately productive. And I wasn't really giving myself time to do things that were not a means to an end. So I had this realization at the end of med school, but I did not actually start having hobbies then because I had the realization I had no time to do anything about it because I was in the interview matching process. But once I got into residency, at least for me in my program, I'm in family medicine, which is known to be a little less stressful than maybe some other residencies like surgery, and good for anyone who does that. But I had a bit more time because we don't have all these exams. We're not under the same like close watchful eye of like every mistake that you do in medical school, and you're not always trying to like schmooze when you're on rotations. Like it's just a bit less stressful, I found. And I was like, okay, like what can I do that's really unproductive and like I'm 100% not going to be good at because I've never done it before. And I was like, oh, pottery. And I found there's like a pottery museum. I live in Toronto. It's like around the corner from where I live. And they have like drop-in classes for like a student rate that's super affordable. So I just started going to those, and I was like objectively so bad at it, but I had so much fun. And you're also like your hands are full of clay. You can't really touch your phone. And yeah, I mean, I'm still not good, but I kept going. I probably go like once a month or so since like about a year ago. But it's honestly been one of the best things I've ever done for my mental health. Like 100%, like journaling is amazing and working out is amazing and going to therapy and all those things. Like I'm not discounting that, but it's so underrated how much having a hobby is important for your mental health. And then since then, I've started to like add to my hobby list, and I was just working on my New Year's goals for 2024. And one of my goals is just to like what I call a hobby day, which is just a day where I engage in a hobby twice a month, which isn't a lot, but it is a lot if you were doing none before, which I did none
Mm-hmm.
for years. So whether it's like pottery or painting or rock climbing I've gotten into or skiing or whatever it might be, and seeing unproductivity as productive, I think is really important. But yeah, that's my little hobby journey. And I really encourage anyone listening to just try something new and be bad at it and like take away that pressure, because no one's expecting me to be like the world's best ceramicist or pottist. Like I'm not trying to sell any of this. I maybe made like a vase for my mom once, but really it's really just for me, and most things are in a cupboard locked away, and some things that are a little cuter I put out on my apartment. But yeah.
Wow, everything you were saying really resonated with me because I think you kind of vocalized what I was thinking about, but didn't know that I needed to have vocalized, you know what I mean? So in 2024, for context, we're filming on January 2nd. This is not going to come out near the beginning of the year, but I realized that as you were saying, all of my hobbies, like reading, kind of revolved around bettering myself. Like everything that I do kind of revolves around bettering myself. And I have these moments where I catch myself and I realize, okay, you're not a constant self-improvement project. You don't have to keep running and running and running and running. Like you are allowed to stop and slow down and enjoy life. And so in 2024, what I'm moving into is like, okay, let's be a human being. Like, we don't have to post everything on social media. Not everything has to be, for some external factor, external validation. I love, art. I love getting my hands dirty. And the thing of what you're saying, like when you're crafting or when you're making art, like your brain is so focused on something that you can't pick up your phone and you can't be distracted by everything that we are normally distracted by. And you also kind of like revert back like for good, like into like your inner child and that childlike joy, just because it's so much fun to create and be bad at something and allow yourself to be bad at something. So that really resonates with me of just being like picking up a hobby that truly is unproductive or like not a means to an end. And that's also why I
Mhm.
read a lot of like I don't know, younger YA books too, because I'm like
Love
I
it.
don't want to be reading,
Mhm.
50 self-help books. At some point they just say the same thing over and over and over again. I want to be reading because I'm enjoying what I'm reading. And so last year I think I read like 15 Rick Riordan books, the author of Percy Jackson. I literally like
Love
that's all I
him.
did for like 2 weeks straight was just like reading quote unquote like unproductive books. And
Mhm.
yeah, this whole take on productivity is actually kind of blowing my mind. I don't know how to like form a sentence right now. Like, wow.
No, I love that. I think the reading piece is so huge. It's definitely I'm still working on like getting into, which I mean I kind of sound like counterintuitive counterintuitive to what I've been saying when I say this, but like getting to more of a routine of reading because I want to read more. But like my goal, I used to read a ton growing up, like up until like high school. I was like, I thought I was going to be an author when I grew up. I loved Rick Riordan. First of all, we can talk about this after,
Mm-hmm.
but I was
Mm-hmm.
like the biggest Percy Jackson girl ever. And I'm so excited to watch the new series on Disney Plus. But that's a separate conversation. But then I totally stopped reading like somewhere through high school, and I didn't read at all like any fiction novels. I think like the end of high school, most of undergrad, and most of medical school, just because if I was reading, I'm like, I need to read something productive. Or maybe I read like one book here or there, but I really let it go because I'm like, it's not productive to read fiction. Like, what am I gaining from reading like a Greek
Mm-hmm.
mythology YA novel? Or what am I gaining from reading like this smut novel, or really like any novel, even like literature novels? I'm like, it's not productive. So I didn't do it for years. And during COVID is when I kind of started reading again, and I've been like gearing up slowly. My goal for last year was a book a month, and I didn't even hit that. I hit like 8, but that was more than the year before, so it was still
Mm-hmm.
good.
Baby
Um,
steps.
but yeah, I think like a huge switch for me as well was swapping out these self-help books, which I was like you're saying, they're all saying the same thing at the end of the day. There were some self-help books that totally changed my life, and I'm so happy that I read when I was really trying to figure out like my perspective for life and how I was going to approach things. But after a certain point, they become super repetitive, and I think it's totally counterproductive to keep listening to them. And swapping that out for just like I don't even want to say silly because that really like demeans them in and of itself, but just like fiction, like just reading to escape and just to enjoy something has been also so huge in my adult life, and is a really like accessible hobby to anyone who's listening. Like, you don't need to like try something you've never done before. You don't need to like go get a membership at like a pottery studio or a rock climbing gym. Like, you can also just like buy a book or like download one on your
Mm-hmm.
Kindle illegally if that's what you want to do. Like, I don't know, but it doesn't have to be expensive. And yeah, it's so important.
Yeah, going into reading, so I read 98 books last year, which I don't recommend
That's
anyone do that. I
crazy.
don't
Oh my
recommend anyone
gosh.
do that. My eyes got so bad. I had to keep going to the eye doctor because I was like, why do my glasses not work? And she was like, it's because you're reading like 12 hours a day, Katie. I don't know what else to say to you. But I used to hate on Colleen Hoover. I don't know if you know Colleen Hoover.
Yes,
Um,
I've read a couple of her books. Yeah.
hmm I've read I think maybe 10. I had a year where that's like all I was reading and I was like, I love Colleen Hoover. And then as you like grow as a reader, you realize, okay, maybe she's more of an introductory type of fiction
Hmm.
author. But going back to what you're saying, like I used to hate on her being like, people who read Colleen Hoover are so silly, like just pick up a different kind of book. But honestly, whatever gets you into reading, gets you
Yeah.
into reading. And I think that I know, and I had to check myself, like I had um some limiting beliefs when it came to reading where I was like, if you're not reading like this type of book, like if you're not reading classics or if you're not reading self-help, nonfiction, like you're not really a reader. And it's like, but that's not true. Like if you're gonna read things on paper, it doesn't matter what you read. And there's
Hmm.
so much merit in reading fiction. Like right now, so I didn't hit 100 books. I wanted to. And because
You were
because
so
I'm
close. You
I
were.
know. I was so close. I was like halfway
You should be so
through.
proud of yourself. That's crazy.
I was halfway through 2 books and then I was just like, there's no way I'm gonna do this. But instead of punishing myself, I've decided that I'm gonna read Divergent. And that's gonna be my first
Ah,
series and the beginning of the
mhm.
year. Because as we were saying, like I also love Percy Jackson. I have a lot of thoughts about the new Percy Jackson TV show that
Oh,
has
okay.
just
We'll
come
talk
out.
later once I watch
Yeah, no,
it.
absolutely. But there's like no such thing as being unproductive with reading, is what I've learned. It's like, regardless of if you're rereading the same book 100 times, if you're reading a YA novel, if you're reading that dystopian book that like you have a childhood connection to, like there's so much you can learn in fiction writing and in fiction characters that like it's not unproductive. And I think I had to reframe that mindset for myself, especially the way I viewed myself and other people when it came to reading, of being like, no, like no one is better or worse because of the types of books they're reading. And I think that's
Hmm.
that's something that I just shift as well, as like society taught me, XYZ is productive and XYZ is not productive. And like, James Clear is productive, but Colleen Hoover isn't. And it's like, are either of them better or worse than each other? At the end of the day,
Yeah.
not really.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up. I haven't read a ton of Colleen Hoover books, and I'm not hating on her at all because I totally agree. Whatever you're interested in, like go for it. I'm I like smut novels, but I like the magical realism ones or like a little bit of fantasy. Like that's just the kind of girl I am. But her
Mm-hmm.
books are good. And the book I read right before my residency interviews was oh my gosh, the pop what's it slipping my mind? The most popular one she
It
has.
ends with us.
It Ends With Us, of course. That was the last book I read right before residency interviews in med school. And on my hobbies or like things I like to do was reading because I had just gotten back into reading towards the end of medical school. And I wanted to put like the most recent book I read was blank on my application because that's like a little starting point. And like in my background for my interviews, they were all on Zoom. I had some of the books I read lined up. And I remember talking to my friends like in medical school, and I was like, I don't know if that sounds like really stupid to have said like the last book I read is It Ends With Us. Like, are they going to judge me for that? And then I was honestly like, that is so sad and so silly. And like, do I really want to be part of a program that's going to judge me because of a book I read? But also, the second part of it was I don't think that book is like necessarily like a remarkable literary masterpiece, but I did learn things from it. And I think it does
Mm-hmm.
touch on a lot of like really important topics. Like, this isn't really a spoiler, but about like domestic abuse and also homelessness and things that are super applicable in the medical field. And
Mm-hmm.
I definitely learned something from it. And it changed my perspective on these things. And yes, it's a fictional story, but it puts you into the shoes of someone who might be experiencing this in real life. And I was like, that's so silly that I would even care what people thought about the book that I read. And I put it on my application and I got in. So I guess it was okay. Or they didn't read it, but either way. But yeah, yeah. I totally agree with everything you said.
I have to say, when I read It Ends With Us, it wasn't big at the time, and so I read it on the plane. I
Mm-hmm.
had no idea what would happen, and I was floored at the plot twist. At
Yeah.
the end, I was like, oh my God, I knew I didn't like him for a reason." And like that book
Yeah.
was crazy. That book was
Yeah.
crazy. Wow, okay. So it's the second day of 2024. Actually, yesterday didn't count, so it's the first day of 2024. And I was wondering, like, you're probably doing some sort of reflections, and in the theme of just kind of like reflecting and all of that, what is one piece of advice you heard in 2023 that has stuck with you?
That's such a good question. I think it's something I specifically learned in 2023 because I feel like all my years blurred together. But I think in general, like one piece of advice that stands out, and it definitely wasn't exactly in 2023, but I think I really like solidified it last year, was to just stop taking advice from everyone and only really take advice from people who you admire as in like want to be more like, because there's a lot of really amazing people on this planet doing tons of really cool things. And it's not, I don't even want to go to say that like people don't have your best intentions because a lot of them do, but their advice might be leading you to follow a path more similar to theirs, which isn't a bad path, it's just a different one, and that's totally okay. But there's also nothing wrong with doing things your own way and nothing wrong with listening to advice, saying thank you, and not necessarily applying it to your own life because we're all on completely different paths. And it would be to your detriment to try to just take everyone's advice on all the different paths you're on and try to follow in their footsteps when your direction might be headed somewhere different. I mean, I don't know if that all totally makes sense, but I think it's just being more selective with what advice you actually implement into your life, and not letting people who are saying what you're doing is different equate to it being wrong. And yeah, something along those lines.
Yeah, when you were talking, it kind of reminded me of our conversation about self-help books. And something I realized was like, not all, I mean, as we said, everyone kind of says the same thing, but like the experience of the author makes such a difference. And I realized that I like reading the self-help books written by women so much more than I like reading the self-help books written by men because they can just relate a little bit more to my experience and my biology a little bit better. And it's also so much more impactful to keep reading and rereading the same self-help books that changed your life as opposed to reading everybody's self-help books because what works for you may not work for someone else, and it's the same thing with advice. It's just like go to the people that you feel most aligned with that are probably doing the same thing that you're doing and ask them for advice, but don't try to take in everyone else's advice. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, sometimes people just say the same thing in different words, and sometimes the way someone says it resonates more with you
Mhm.
than another person. So like for example, I read a lot of like Mark Manson's books. I think that's his name. I didn't really like them. I didn't like it was like the subtle art of not giving a fuck. And I was like listening to a lot of his stuff on YouTube, and I didn't really resonate with him. Not that there's anything wrong with him, but I was just like, that's just not the way he's delivering the message, what he's saying, his life experiences, it's just not hitting with me. And so after a while, kind of in that thing of like, we need to stop reading self-help books, like, they're saying the same thing. I was just like, I'm just gonna cut out all kind of like male self-help book authors, which I know is kind of that's a big statement, and I'm gonna pedal back because I do
It's
still
your
read.
truth.
I'm
It's
like,
your
I
truth.
do still read a lot of self-help books, but at this point I'm like, there's, I don't know, a limit to the amount of advice. There's a limit to the amount of self-help books I can read and actually absorb. And so what you're saying about, making sure that like you take everybody's advice with a grain of salt really resonates to me, especially like in this realm of self-help books, because that's what I've thought about the most.
Yeah. I mean, that's such a good point that like I think about it more in like the people around you in your day-to-day life, but definitely it applies to not only self-help books, but also like people online, like also me and you. Like if I always like want to like preface everything I say and I kind of stop myself. So I'm like, I feel like I'm getting repetitive, but like if my advice doesn't work for you, like that's totally fine. Like I'm just sharing my experience, the way I approach life. If me saying things like, you're not too busy to quote unquote do it all and take care of, like if that doesn't resonate with you, like that's totally fine, and I do not have all the answers. It's just my experience. And I think especially as someone who now is a medical professional and also like in a professional sense works with people on their mental health and their physical health and things like that, I always kind of want to separate that from sometimes just like my advice online, because those are two totally different things. When
Hmm.
I'm like, if I would never sit down with a patient and just give them the advice on how to lead their lives, because that's not an objective truth. That's just my truth. The objective truth might be like, look, exercising is really good for your mental health, or look, maybe you should consider medications for whatever you're going through. Those things are objective. My opinion on how to approach life, my opinion to, I mean, I guess I was going to say to like engage in pottery, but really I actually do think that is objective, and there is a lot of research around unproductive hobbies. But
Hmm.
nonetheless, like it's just people's opinions, and they're often not malintended. Maybe that's just me being naive and an optimist, but I think most people don't have it out for you. Some people might, but most people want to help you, but their goals are just slightly different than yours, or the journey that they want to take towards their goals is different than yours, and that's totally okay.
That really resonates. So I have some community questions about kind of productivity, kind of the trap of productivity that we've been speaking on
Mm-hmm.
that I want to highlight before the end of the episode. So one of
Let's do
the
it.
questions is, can you speak on the mindset that if we aren't being productive, what are we doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think we spoke to it a little bit before, but it's kind of cheesy, but it's the saying of like, we aren't human doings, we're human beings. And just being is productive and is kind of the point of it all. Like, you could die tomorrow, anyone could. And like, are you going to be remembered for how productive you were? Probably not. Like maybe if you were super successful, but really the people in your life, people who care about you, are going to remember you for the way that you treated them, your personality, the way that you spoke to them, the way that you engaged with the world, not just for how many hours you studied that day. So I think really just trying to remember like what really matters at the end of the day, and not just how people remember you, but if you were, God forbid, to die tomorrow, like would you look back on your life thinking, I'm so happy that I spent all of my 20s holed up in a library? Or would you be happy thinking, oh, well, I had so many great career successes. Maybe I was able to impact people with my career, but I'm so happy that I just like enjoyed the outdoors, or I'm so happy that I spent time like nurturing my relationship. So I think just like, and again, maybe that's not your truth too, but at least for me, like those are things that I know I would value at the end of the day, the things that I also value about other people. Like I'm not friends with any of my friends because of how productive they are. I'm not even friends with them because of how smart they are or what their careers are. I'm friends with them because of the way that they interact with the world and the way that they treat other people. And I think that's just something that maybe like think to yourself, what are the reasons you pick the people you surround yourself with, and try to emphasize more of that. But yeah, and then I think like on top of that, it's also remembering that more time spent working does not equate to productivity, and you can be productive and also just be efficient with your time and maximize your time for the things that really matter. So also kind of separating that as well. Like I'm not saying this to say, okay, and because of that, you should quit your jobs, drop out of school, and like never try to be productive again. Like that's not really the point. It's just change the way you think of productivity and don't equate the number of hours spent as more successful.
And going off of that is also like just reframe what you see as productive. Like
Mm-hmm.
even the conversation on unproductive hobbies, that is productive because
A
it's
hundred
allowing you to
percent.
be creative. It's time off of your phone, which number one, I would say is very productive just to like stop that doom scrolling, stop that social media rot. But so I'm a behavioral science student and there is actually research behind, like diminishing marginal returns of like the more hours you spend on something, the less gain you get from each hour spent. And so there's like an
Mm-hmm.
optimal amount of time to be studying or to be doing other things. And I think about behavioral science in my daily life like all the time. I mean, not because I'm studying it, but just because I find it fascinating. And so there comes a point when I'm studying as well where I'm just like, it is more productive to do other things that maybe society doesn't value as productive, right? Like making a really nice homemade meal or going to hang out with my friends or calling my mom. Like that's not technically moving the needle forward in my career, but it is productive in the sense that it's going to fill my cup. It's going to make sure that I am like the best human being and the best version of myself that I can be. And to me, that is more productive. And that's like the saying of like, rest is productive. Yes, anything you rest is productive to a certain point, just like exercise is productive to a certain point. But if we take everything in extremes, that's when we get all wishy-washy. So rest is productive just as exercise is productive, just as calling your mom is productive. So I love like what you were saying. It was like, the hours worked doesn't equate to how productive you are. And also just this idea of reframing what you see as productivity and a good value to your time.
Yeah, absolutely. I resonate with everything you said.
So the second question that I got from the community, and we kind of already touched on this as well, but how do you stop yourself from constantly doing more rather than focusing on the quality of your work?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot of the similar stuff that we just spoke about, but I think on top of that, it goes back to something else that we mentioned earlier of just like calling yourself out if you feel like the way you're acting maybe goes against what you actually believe to be true. So the example I gave earlier was like me saying that you shouldn't put your career and your academic success as like your most important quality trait. But then even when I like introduced myself, you kind of start with that anyway. So I
Hmm.
think just like calling yourself out and not in a way to like beat yourself up about it, but just being like, oh, like I see that, noting that. And that I think is the first step to making change. And it's not about like, okay, you're awful and you're not even listening to your own advice and how could you and really going down that rabbit hole, but just kind of like calling yourself out and acknowledging that there's still ways that you can continue to work towards the person that you want to be and doing so in a way that's gentle and kind to yourself. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think that that's what I would add to that question. But yeah, it's all really interconnected in a way. And I think once you start having kind of like one of these realizations, a lot of them start to kind of follow suit afterwards.
Hmm. It reminds me of in AA, like the first step is admitting that you're an alcoholic. Not saying that anyone is an alcoholic, but it is that piece of like acceptance and also vocalizing it and just being aware of when you are kind of equating productivity with extra work or all of that. So yeah, definitely resonating with me as well.
I love this conversation. I think it's so, so important. And again, like emphasizing it's not that I feel like I have all the answers. Like I think I'm still working through a lot of these constructs, but it's something I really am passionate about talking about because I think I didn't even realize at the time how much some of these false beliefs were really negatively impacting me. Like I didn't realize the weight that it was really taking. And now stepping away from some of that, like how much better life got so easily just by like ditching this whole like hustle culture and productivity mindset is huge. So I mean, it's something that I think if it resonates someone listening, like that makes me so happy to hear because it's so, so important. But yeah, I mean, you're wonderful. This was great and I'm so happy to be here.
I'm gonna think about our conversation about unproductive hobbies for a while. So just know that like even if it doesn't resonate with anyone listening, it resonates with me, and that's all that matters.
I love to hear that.
Well, thank you so much. I want to give you like 30 seconds to kind of promote whatever you want, where people can find you, drop all your links, all your socials, all of that. So the time is yours.
Yeah, totally. Well, my handle on Instagram and TikTok is my name. So it's at noamraiter, which is well my first and last name. And then my podcast is You Are Not Too Busy, or You Are Not Too Busy podcast, also on social media. I'm excited to start. I guess this is going live later than we're filming. So I probably am already posting new episodes. So if you want to hear a bit more of me, you can check me out over there. But yeah, no, that's on me. But thank you so much for giving me the space to chat today. It was wonderful.
Incredible. Well, all of your links will be down below. So if you want to go check her out on TikTok, Instagram, the podcast, all of it, go check her out. She's really cool. And yeah, thank you so much again for coming on.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Solidarity on the Bench with KDU. If you enjoyed this podcast or want to submit a question for future guests, you can follow the podcast Instagram at solidaritypod or follow the host at katie.eu. See you next Tuesday.